This morning we are excited to hear what Pastor Peter is going to share with us. We've been up in Penang since Monday and Tuesday, sharing the same message, and it has been very well received. Last night we were in Seremban for the first time, sharing the message on God Tsunami. The God Tsunami is like a 101 into the School of Ministry. So they were also very excited, and they're clamoring for him to go back next year. So we truly want to thank the Lord that we in KL has been so blessed because we have been having him every year. Penang has been having him a few years, Kuching, but for us here in Klang Valley, we have been so blessed to have him speak to us into our lives. Many of us have been transformed by many of these messages. So why don't you put your hands together and welcome Pastor Peter.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome. It's really wonderful to be back in Kuala Lumpur again. It's great to be back in Malaysia. As Pastor Stephen said, we've already had a wonderful time in Penang and Seremban, and and now I'm getting to the point where I can tell the difference between the different kinds of durian. And so they tell me I've passed this invisible test, after all of these years. And so we've really had a wonderful time, and I'm looking forward to what God has for today. What we have scheduled is 4 teaching sessions throughout the day, 2 in the morning, and we'll break for lunch, and then 2 in the afternoon. And each of these is prepared to be part of a progression, so one message will lead to another, and it has to do with breakthrough in your life, in your nation, and welcoming the kingdom of God, preparing the way for God to establish His kingdom in us and through us. Now, in our land and our region in the Middle East, we're going through a time of historic change. These are really the birth pangs of the end times. Jesus said that we'll face wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled by these things. They must come to pass. And this is the kind of thing that we're facing in the Middle East. And as the situation shapes up, we're realizing that this is not just another passing season, but really a turning point for so many throughout our region. Those of you who have wondered about coming to Israel, well, Israel itself has been the quietest we've been in a long, long time. And the economy is prospering, and the culture is vibrant. It's a really good time to come and to visit us in the land of Israel. And here in Malaysia, I've been coming, as Pastor Stephen said, for the last decade or more. And we can really feel that this also is a time of change, that you're coming to a point, really a turning point that has been prayed for many, many years. And I really feel like some of the messages that God has given me today is really to focus on that turning point and what it means for us as Christians, and how to go through that breakthrough, and even to understand that the breakthrough itself is not an end in itself. The breakthrough comes so that you can go beyond. And now would be the time prophetically to really hear what God is saying about what He wants next. I mean, the people of God, have this visionary ability. And it is to see the end as well as the beginning. God lays a highway for our feet, and I believe that He wants us to prepare, to look forward with expectancy and with faith that things are really going to change, and we're going to be in a different environment just within the next few years. But I believe now is the time to look even beyond that and understand God's purposes and what he wants to do. Now, before I get started, I want to thank Pastor Sam Ang and PJEFC for your warm welcome. It's so great to be back here again. Thank you very much. Okay. And of course, Taryn Fu and all of the SOM, our SOM graduates, and the team here in Kuala Lumpur have done just this terrific job. I think there's almost 50 volunteers, is that right? Who have dedicated hours and hours of their time to help organize this event and make things run smoothly. And so I just really like to say thank you to Taryn and your entire team. You can tell them they're wearing these wonderful blue shirts. Yeah. Thank you all very much. And in this, I want to include Yvette Tang and of course, the wonderful worship team. It's great to hear you sing in Hebrew. It makes me feel right at home. And actually, a few of those songs were written in our home congregation on Mount Carmel. And so, I remember when they were written. And so it's really is a wonderful touch. And then, of course, Pastor Stephen and his wife, Lorna, without the two of you, I wouldn't have been coming back year after year after year. So thank you very much, Pastor Stephen. Okay, so in this first session, I want to talk to you about being part of God's faithful remnant. Now, in the Bible, there's a chosen example nation. And God chose this nation of Israel. He actually created the nation of Israel from one man. He chose Abraham and found in Abraham a man with certain qualities that could be his friend, a man of faith, a man of obedience, a man who was of integrity. And God said, we're going to be friends, Abraham. I'm going to make a covenant with you and a promise. Out of you is going to come a people and for my own purposes. And so God actually built Israel from a very small beginning from one person, and Israel then, fills the pages of the Bible. But the focus of the Bible on Israel is not out of favoritism, and it's not to say that Israel is superior or Israel is better. The reason there's so much about Israel in the Bible is because Israel was created and chosen by God as His example for all the nations. And so there's so much about Israel in the Bible because we're invited to use Israel as a template, as a picture for how God wants to work in all the nations of the world. Remember, God said to Abraham, in you and in your seed, all the families of their earth will be blessed. I mean, this was right at the time when he was making that covenant with Abraham. So we're invited to draw those spiritual parallels and to extract meaning for our time from the biblical example of Israel. Now, Israel is an example of something small that God made great. And we usually, in human society, we usually honor the great and the powerful and the mighty and the famous and the beautiful. But God really isn't that way. He looks specifically, he seeks for the small, and I think God treasures the things that are small. And if you don't understand this about our great and mighty God, I don't think you really can understand his heart. That God, who is all of those things, he's great, he's mighty, he's powerful, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he has all the authority, all the power that anyone could ever want or anyone could ever need. And yet, his heart is that he goes seeking for the small, for the humble, for the weak, for the powerful. He goes looking for those things that are small yet deserving that he himself can make great. And take a look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and let's look in verse 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 27. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God had chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong. Well, God specifically looks for the small. And, sometimes we need to be reminded of this and to learn not to despise the day of small beginnings. Everything that God makes great always starts out as something very, very small. And every new thing that God does starts out so small that it's very hard for people to recognize. But then as God adds his blessing to it, as we commit ourselves to it, as we continue in faithfulness, God makes it grow into something big. Abraham was chosen to be a mighty nation. God changed his name and said, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Your descendants will be more numerous than the stars in the heaven or the sand on the sea. But the truth is, throughout his lifetime, Abraham never really saw any of that. He just remained faithful. He had a son. God even commanded him to sacrifice his son, and he was willing to do that. I mean, this is an incredible man of faith and obedience. I mean, to take the one child you have that is the key to everything that God has promised you. If you're going to be a father of a great nation, it's going to start somewhere. So now he finally has that one son, and then God says, now offer that son back to me. So we see that Abraham throughout his life was just faithful with the little that he had. And the promise was passed on then to Isaac and then to Jacob, and they went into Egypt, and still by the time the end of Abraham's life, they were really just an extended family with the big promise. So, but that became the nation of Israel, that became God's example for all time. And we're invited to draw that parallel. Now, Jesus taught in parables, and these are small little stories that teach us a great heavenly truth. So he taught little stories, and we're invited to draw from those stories a parallel to our time and to understand what he's saying to us today. So what I'd like to do is, in that spirit, I want to tell you a story from the Bible that is pretty well known. Certainly in Israel, it's a story that is read in all of our congregations and in all of our synagogues at least once a year. It's the story of Esther. And Esther is read during the holiday of Purim in the springtime, when we celebrate the deliverance of the Jewish people from enemies that were much stronger than them. And of course, in the book of Esther, we're talking about the kingdom of Persia. So I'd like to take you to that story, if you will. Now, we know that Esther, at the time of Esther, the Jewish people were exiles in the nation of Persia. Now, the Bible uses words like Shushan or Susa, but understand it is the modern-day people of Iran, and that's where the people of Israel had been taken captive. And Esther and her family were exiles in that land. And Esther, as you know, of course, is a beautiful young lady of Jewish heritage. She was an orphan, and her parents had died, and she was being raised by her relative, a man named Mordecai. And the story goes that this king, Ahasuerus, we call him in Hebrew. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English. We say Ahasuerus. He was like a major monarch, and he ruled an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia, according to the Bible. One of the great empires of the world. Probably in his day, he may have been the greatest king of his entire era. And he had the Jewish people as this remnant of exiles in his kingdom. And for some reason, Ahasuerus' wife Vashti displeased him, and so he got rid of her. I mean, these kings, they would do whatever they wanted to do. And he looked for another wife. And according to the book of Esther, they had this beauty pageant in Susa, in the capital city. And Esther won the contest and was made the queen of this incredible empire. So now you have this exiled Jewish girl. All of a sudden, because of her beauty, she becomes the queen of the biggest empire of her day. Then her relative Mordecai hears about a plot that is being hatched by this evil, power-hungry bureaucrat named Haman. That he hears about a plot to eliminate the Jewish people, to make their exile even worse, and to bring them into complete slavery or to eliminate them altogether. And so what he does is, in the end, Mordecai goes to young Esther, who is now the queen of this empire, and he challenges her with these words. And I believe we're invited. This is a biblical parable, and we're invited to understand what God is speaking spiritually to us through this. So take a look in Esther chapter 4. And here's what Mordecai says to his young relative, Esther. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape more than all of the Jews. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." So Mordecai goes to Esther and he says, "Listen, you're not in. You haven't received the position that you have by accident, and because you are who you are and you are where you are, it's time to make right decisions. You have to take the responsibility to make some decisions and take some actions that are right. And if you fail to do this, well, God will do what he needs to do some other way. He'll find another way, because God has purposes that he will accomplish it with us or without us. But if he has to choose another way, you and all the rest of us, we may perish. But And we may lose our freedoms, and we may be destroyed. However, think about this. Maybe this is all God's plan, to have brought you to this very place at this particular moment just for his purposes. Who knows? But this may be God's plan, to have brought you to this place at just such a time as this. And so these words go into Esther, and she realizes that what Mordecai is saying is true. It is time to make right decisions, and it is time to take action. But it's not without risk on her part. In those days, if you went into the presence of this king of Persia without being invited, the penalty was death. I mean, that's how they cleared his schedule, okay? If you went in uninvited, you died. Unless when he saw you, he raised his scepter, okay, in acceptance, and then you would live and you could have a few words with him. I mean, that's how it worked. I mean, listen, he ruled with an iron fist, and he ruled half of the world then. Okay, so even the queen was under this rule. And so she says, okay, well, what this means is I've got to go in and talk to the king. And think about this. She may not have even at that point even revealed to him that she was Jewish. I mean, she won the beauty contest and she got awarded, okay, and became the queen. But it never says that she told him all about her background. And so now she's going to go into the king, maybe for the first time reveal who she really is, and then make an appeal that he issue a royal decree that's going to save her and save her people. And so it's a very risky thing. There's no guarantee that this is going to work. But as she considers it and as she prays, I believe she came to the conclusion this is the right thing to do. And this is how she answered her relative Mordecai. Take a look in verse 15. So then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go and assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." She came to the point where she realized that what God wanted to do was more important to more of her people than even the value of her own life. So she was ready to put her life, her position, her happiness, her future on the line to see that God's will would be done among her people and in that particular nation. So in this, we learn that Esther was more than a pretty face. We realize now that Esther is a woman of good judgment. We understand now that she's a woman of character. And later we learn that she's a woman of considerable charm and wisdom. Okay, she handles the situation with real precision. And you read the story to understand how well she did. But she and Mordecai decide on this plan to bring about God's purposes, and in this, they become an example for us of the power of the faithful remnant. Okay, they were. What did they have in Persia? I mean, they were exiles. They were outsiders. They were a small minority group. They didn't have political power. They didn't have wealth. But they had some things that God had given them, and because they were willing to use the things that God had given them and make right decisions, we see that they brought about a tremendous deliverance. And in fact, as the story unfolds, as they go forward with making the decisions and taking the actions that they believe are right before God, and putting themselves at risk in order to do this, somehow the weight and the authority and the movement of power in that nation of Persia, it moves off of the shoulders of this king Ahasuerus, who ruled from India to Ethiopia. And in fact, what the story shows, that at a certain point, that weight, that authority starts to rest on the little beautiful shoulders of Esther. And that's why we call it the book of Esther, because by making those right decisions and being a part of what God wanted to do, she and Mordecai actually turned the course of history. And I use this to illustrate to you the power of being a part of the faithful remnant. God loves the small. God looks for the small and the humble. He started Israel. He later said to Israel, I didn't choose you as my example nation because you were a mighty nation, because you were more in number. Rather, I chose you just because I loved you. I chose you when you were the smallest nation. You were actually one person. That's when I chose you. And I chose you just because I loved you. God loves the small. He goes looking for the small, the weak, and the humble who have those characteristics, the willingness to follow him in obedience and trust, the readiness to make right decisions, and in the case of Esther, to have the courage to do what is right in spite of the fact that it meant considerable risk to her and her family. So I want to talk to you a few things about being a part of this faithful remnant that's revealed to us through the book of Esther. First of all, being an exile, I think, is part of the remnant experience. You know, the more I read the Bible, the more I see that over and over again, God uses people who are exiles. You know, exiles, and you can be an exile for many different reasons. Some people, like Joseph, okay, became exiles because he was betrayed by his brother and he ended up a stranger in a strange land, okay? So he ended up, in a foreign country, and then he ended up as a convict and a prisoner and a slave, okay? So Joseph is really a picture of being an exile. But you know what? You can be an exile in your own land too. You don't have to be sent to another country. Some people become exiles in their own nations because of religious differences or racial differences. I mean, look at Moses. Moses here, he's a Hebrew slave, but he's raised as an Egyptian prince, and then later he becomes, after he kills the Egyptian overseer, he becomes a criminal and a fugitive and spends the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd in Midian. I mean, here's this man, he's never where he belongs, if you understand what I'm saying. Right? He's always an exile. He's always an outsider. And yet this is the person that God specifically chooses. Says, I'm looking for a real leader. And he didn't choose someone who was like everybody else. He went looking and he found a man called Moses. So David here, he's anointed. He's chosen to be king of his people. But he didn't become king right away. You know the story of David. How, for political reasons, he was forced out, and he spent years as a fugitive, hiding in caves, surrounded by outcasts and other people who, had similar problems, in the nation. He becomes also a picture of an exile, and yet God says, that's a man after my own heart. I'm going to give him authority. I'm going to establish his kingdom that will never end. Again and again, God has not just used the small and the weak and the helpless to accomplish his purposes, but I think he specifically looks for the exile. And Esther and Mordecai, they're classic exiles. They're a remnant. And I believe the faithful remnant are always exiles in some way. I myself, this is part of my personal story. Back in the days when I was growing up, I was born in the United States. My grandparents were immigrants to the U.S. from Japan over 100 years ago. And when they arrived as immigrants in the land of the free and the home of the brave, they weren't allowed to be citizens for decades. And then my parents came along, and since they were actually born in America, they were granted citizenship. But then the Second World War came along, and Japan was an enemy of the United States. And so my relatives, over 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens of America, were shipped off out of California and the West Coast and spent 4 years of the war in camps surrounded by barbed wire and machine guns. My father used to tell me this story. He said, well, he joined the American Army and became an officer during the Second World War. And so one time on leave, he had to go visit his mother in one of these camps in the desert. And so he arrives at the camp in his officer's uniform, and all the guards, they have to stand at attention and salute him. And so now he can go through the barbed wires and visit his mother, who's basically a prisoner for the rest of the war. All right. It was an injustice. And it was based on race and war hysteria. But the American government, about 30 years later, did apologize. And under Presidents Clinton and Reagan, an official apology was written. And they said, yes, it was racial prejudice, it was war hysteria, and an injustice was done to you. We're sorry about that. And they paid a token amount to the survivors of all of that. But I understand what it is to be an outsider, because after that, when I was 10 years old, my family moved to Japan. My father was sent by he was employed then by the American government. He was sent to Japan. And so there in Japan, I looked like everybody else. But as soon as I opened my mouth, the Japanese would look at me and they go, "You're not from around here, are you?" Now, of course, my situation and living in the land of Israel, I'm used to this by now. My citizenship is in heaven. And so, I'm telling you something that is not far from my own story and not far from my own experience as well. God definitely, in my case, chooses the foolish things to confound the wise, and the weak things to confound the strong. And I've seen him time and time again look for the small, look for the insignificant, look for the weak, so that he can be shown to be truly a great God. All right, now listen, when you're part of a faithful remnant, you have to find your gift and your calling from God. Because at the end of the day, that's all you really have. And let me say that again. If you're part of the faithful remnant, one thing is really important for you individually. You need to find your calling from God. You need to get your identity from Him. If I hadn't at a certain point in my life gotten my identity from God and gotten my citizenship settled in heaven, I would have been a very confused person to this day. I was a very confused young man. You have to understand your calling and find your gift from God, because at the end of the day, God says, I'll never change my mind about you. I'll never change my mind about your gift and your calling. Remember it says in Romans chapter 11, specifically about Israel, but again, we're invited to draw that parallel with ourselves. He says, the gifts and the calling of God are without repentance. God says, what I give and when I decide something about you, I don't change my mind. That's it. So when you get that, you've got something that is true, that is real every day of your life. Every day of your life, you have something that God will never take away. The political situation can change, your financial system can change, your friends can change, your church can change, the world can change around you, but your gift and your calling will never be taken away. So when you're part of the faithful remnant, you need to find that. And that's what you see in Esther and Mordecai. I mean, Esther has this gift. She's beautiful, all right? She didn't make herself beautiful. God made her beautiful. And then we learn that she's more than a pretty face. She's got character, she's got courage, and she's got wisdom. She has this gift. She's beautiful, and she's courageous, and she's ready to make right decisions. Mordecai, on the other hand, he really has a gift of wisdom. And I see in Mordecai a man who had two kinds of wisdom. The first kind of wisdom we see in Mordecai is, you might call it a worldly wisdom. Listen, there's nothing second class about worldly wisdom. It just means you understand how the world works. You've got to have someone around who does. And Esther needed a Mordecai. He knew how the political situation in Persia worked. He understood the power struggles that went on in Shushan, his capital. He understood the position of Haman versus the king and all the different factions and the provincial leaders. He understood the workings of the world in which he lived. He had a practical worldly wisdom. But that's not all that Mordecai had. He had yet another kind of wisdom as well. The second kind of wisdom that we see in Mordecai, he has a spiritual wisdom. He knows who God is. He knows the real God. Friends, if you don't think this is an advantage, you need to think again. Because knowing God and knowing who He is gives you a tremendous advantage in every area of your life, if you're willing to see it as wisdom. Mordecai knows who God is, and because he knows who God is, he knows what God is going to do. And that's what he says to Esther. He says, listen, Esther, you've got to make right decisions, and you've got to step out now, because God has plans that He will accomplish in our nation with us or without us. You know, he knew this about God, and so he has this spiritual wisdom about God and about God's purposes. And so you put that together with his worldly understanding about the power struggles that were going on in his nation, and you add to that the spiritual wisdom that he had about God and God's kingdom. He's the ideal counselor for beautiful and courageous Esther. So together, they make up a very powerful faithful remnant. And I think this is the other thing you need to learn about the faithful remnant. If you're in the faithful remnant, you have to learn to work together. You've got to understand that God has chosen you as that remnant. He's given different gifts. He's given different callings. But you need to find a way to to maximize your strengths and your abilities by working together. And this is exactly what we see in Esther and Mordecai. So they're a special